Okay, just wanted to comment on some replies I've gotten on my research. Um, I was contacted recently by a synthesizer engineer, so that got me into um, looking at the synthesizer community, the research that they do, the engineering. And I used to play synthesizer, but I never really got into the specifics of it. But um, basically, the key connection between the quantum transitional frequency, which is what Heisenberg discovered, and the music theory, what I've called the Hempel effect, but it's actually not the Hempel effect. It was the great debate between Helmholtz and Koenig, and it's something I first discovered in this book called Magic of the Senses. But it's ironically it's basically the same paradox that Heisenberg discovered, which is this inherent non-commutativity as a overlap of the future and the past in what's called fundamental time in mathematics. So it's a non-locality. It's beyond just quantum entanglement, but it's inherently non-local as a pure time or fundamental time before space-time, and so it's considered an active information as proto-consciousness. So, as Professor Basil J. Hiley describes it, what Heisenberg discovered is that the phase of the amplitude is actually this transitional frequency. And so that when the phase of the amplitude is a transitional frequency, you end up getting the non-commutative dynamic of the past and the future. And normally science assumes, like, if you prove something in science, it has to be repeatable. But what that means in quantum physics is that it's never repeatable. And so what Basil J. Hiley is pointing out is that the assumption of quantum physics normally is that the foundation reality is statistical and random. But the non-commutativity means that it actually just appears to be random, and there's no need for any statistics, because you're relying on a negative probability, which is normally not allowed. It would have to be a negative probability because it's a negative frequency when you have a time reversed signal from the future. And the reason it's a signal is because it's not random. And so normally they just say, well, it's a quantum correlation and it can't be a signal. But they're assuming there that you're having to use a classical signal based on amplitude. But instead what you're doing is you're using the transitional frequency that's non-commutative. So it's like the imaginary, it's not quite the same as an imaginary number because it's not commutative geometry. And an imaginary number normally assumes a commutative geometry for the mathematics. So that's why they usually say it's like quaternions or Clifford algebra, because then you have a non-commutative algebra. And this is what Steinmetz used to analyze Tesla. Also, he called it wattless power. Um, and he used the quaternions, and so he used like rotors. That's what they call it in Clifford algebra. But I don't do the math. I just read about it and study the philosophy of the science. And so the irony being that in music theory, when you have this same change of the phase of the amplitude based on a difference between the overtone and undertone of the perfect fifth and the fundamental tone and the octave, so you have essentially the first and second harmonic. Um, I get confused with the overtones versus harmonics, but that's the whole point, is that the Western music theory assumes that the perfect fourth is a harmonic as a harmonic ratio, but that's again relying on commutative geometry. But if you rely on listening, then there is no perfect fourth as a natural overtone. It doesn't exist. And that's due to a mathematical reason, because when you're relying on the fundamental tonic or fundamental pitch as the one, then you can't have the denominator be a non equivalent pitch. So if you have a perfect fourth as 4/3 for the overtone, you can't have 3 in the denominator, because mathematically 3 does not go into 2. So it has to be a 2 multiple of the root tonic for the same pitch. So what that means is that the 1 is actually this non-material energy information. It's a new kind of force that was discovered in quantum physics that David Bohm called the quantum potential. And what this quantum potential is also negative entropy or negentropic, which means the information is actually also gravitationally repulsive. It's a anti-gravity force, and it's also an organizing information from the future. And so the reason this is normally ignored, like Basil J. Haley points out that Richard Feynman did not use the quantum potential, and that was the problem. And that Dirac acknowledged it, but then he tried to cover it up using, commutative geometry again. So when you have the non-commutative mathematics, you're able to then establish this field of the quantum potential that then is like a guiding information that explains the non-locality of the two-slit experiment that otherwise, Richard Feynman claimed it's unexplainable. But they've been demonstrating this experimentally using the weak measurements for photons. So what Basil J. Haley was doing with Robert Fleck at UCL, the University College of London, they were using particles with mass, so instead of just the photons. And the reason you want the particle with mass is to show that precisely that phase of the amplitude is the non-commutative transitional frequency, and also that it's non-commutative in terms of time and frequency. So like with the weak measurements, you have the modular Yakir Aronoff calls modular momentum, but the momentum is directly proportional to the frequency as the energy of the particle. And so he's like, with these weak measurements using entangled photons, they have proven that the future directly affects the past. And Yakir Aronoff says, well, this doesn't violate causality because you're literally doing the experiment in the future to show this, because the weak measurement is able to maintain the entanglement. And I don't understand all the details. Again, I'm not a scientist. I don't do the experiments. But what my claim is that through meditation, if you're relying on listening directly, then the equivalent in music theory is that you have this transitional frequency that, again, was the paradox that Koenig and Helmholtz debated, where the person, if you look at the Fourier analysis of the change of the amplitude and the phase, it looks like it should sound differently, because you're having basically, the way I understand it is the perfect fifth has been changed into a perfect fourth. But if you understand this paradox in terms of listening, how it's explained in Indian music theory, in which, East India from India, is that if you have a drone as a perfect fourth above the playing with the fundamental pitch, the fundamental tone, you have those two together, even though the perfect fourth is a higher frequency as an overtone, it actually is heard as the new fundamental, because it's not a natural overtone, but rather it creates a octave equivalent as a perfect fifth undertone to the fundamental pitch with the drone. And so you have this fascinating dynamic going on where what's heard as the fundamental pitch being lower is actually constantly changing as a non-materialistic dynamic of the future affecting the past, because when you play the perfect fourth against the fundamental pitch, even though the perfect fourth is a higher pitch, all of a sudden you're creating this new fundamental pitch because of the mathematics of the sound resonance. So this was the claim of Pythagoras originally, what was called the Tetractys of Pythagorean philosophy, and it's based on listening in silence through meditation. It's called the infinite spiral of fifths in music theory. And how it's normally explained in with the Pythagorean comma is that they're already assuming that the ratio, the fraction 2/3 is a ratio that's a harmonic commutative geometry. So what they do is they turn it into a logarithmic equation already. So they say 2 to the 19th is not the same as 3 to the 12th. And that's the Pythagorean comma. But what they've done is they reduce the perfect fifths as 2/3 or 3/2, and they've reduced it because they're assuming that the 2 in the ratio of 2/3 and 3/2 is a commutative geometry equivalent with the 1, and therefore it can be just added as a logarithm. So you have the 2, it would be 2 to the 12th, and then you're adding it to the 7 octaves of it would line up with for the Pythagorean comma. So instead of 2 to the 7th, it's now 2 to the 19th against 3 to the 12th. So that's normally how the Pythagorean comma is explained, but by doing that, they are ignoring the fact that 3/2 and 2/3 are non-commutative, and as the music ratio. So even though you have the same number 3 for the because it's a ratio, the 3 is G as an overtone for 3/2, but then it's a pitch of F as an undertone for 2/3. So in Western music theory, what they just say is that 2/3 as an undertone does not exist. It cannot exist. Whereas the perfect fourth as a harmonic ratio can exist as 4/3, even though it goes against the natural resonance of 4/3, which is never a natural overtone because of this non-commutativity as a perfect fifth undertone octave. In other words, if you double 3/2 and then you double it, or you double 2/3, you get 4/3. So because of this non-commutative dynamic, it's what Alain Kahn calls 2, 3, and infinity. So the simplest explanation of non-commutativity is the music theory is 2, 3, and infinity. And that's what his talk, Music of Shapes, is about. But he doesn't go into the mathematical details of the music theory. What he does mention is that if you look at the Pythagorean comma, you have 2 to the 19th is not equal to 3 to the 12th, but that's for the overtone series. But when you try to put it back into the octave equivalent, that's as exponentials. 3 to the 12th is not equal to 2 to the 19th. But for the logarithms, when you put it back into the scale, then you have 2 to the 1/12th is not equal to 3 to the 1/19th. So that demonstrates that the transitional frequency is non-commutative in the exponentials. So the exponentials have a non-commutative ratio within them in the mathematics. So when you collapse the exponentials back into as overtones back into the scale, the octave 12-note scale as logarithms, then you have to reverse the ratio so that the 3 is now 2 to the 1/12th, whereas, or 2 to the 1/19th, or 3 is to the 1/19th, whereas before it was to the 12th, and then the 2 is to the 1/12th, whereas before it was to the 19th. So that's demonstrating that there's an inherent non-commutativity to the ratios themselves without any space-time equivalent of the pitch as C, G, or F. And so what Basil J. Hiley is emphasizing is that this active non-commutative information then exists before matter as particles exist, and it exists before space-time with an assumed linear primitive causality, and it's going on all the time as a positive pressure that's anti-gravitational force. It's also negentropic, whether humans measure it or not. So this means that the non-locality exists inherent to reality as an active information that is like a formative cause, because it's creating form from the formless of the information directly. That's what Louis de Broglie called the law of phase harmony. So so you have this time reverse signal that's superluminal and a negative frequency and then it's overlapped with the positive frequency, and you can just show that with the 1 and the 2/3 and the 3/2. And then there's basically no zero, or because the information is always there, eternally. And whether and then physics professor Paul S. Wesson, he realized this explained the universe as a fifth dimensional black hole, but it also explains spiritual phenomenon. And he says you don't have to be religious or spiritual, but it does explain it if you're into those things. So that's the connection between the transitional frequency paradox in quantum physics and the music theory paradox that I noticed when I was in high school. And then it was rediscovered in terms of the listening, the difference between listening and the visual measurement of time and frequency changing the amplitude through a change in the phase. And so in alchemy, this is called the single perfect yang, but it's how the non-dualism is from the perfect fifth. The perfect fifth that then has an inherent non-dualism to it that's non-local, of the future and the past overlapping. And since it can't be seen visually, it has to rely on listening and through meditation to then access this level of reality. And since Westerners are so trained in the Platonic philosophy, relying on this commutative geometry from irrational magnitude, which is also called materialistic idealism, then they're constantly projecting this external measurement problem, and without realizing that you should be relying on listening as logical inference. And so in my recent correspondence with somebody about these topics, they were repeatedly saying, well, I think we can solve the comma of Pythagoras problem. We can figure out a way to fix the tuning. And that was the original Western claim, was that, well, we need to maintain this symmetric commutative geometry of the octaves, and so we can get different kind of tuning systems so we can have harmony, without realizing that there's this deeper level of harmony based on listening. And that's what my training manual gets into, is the biology of the listening process. So I won't go into the details there, but basically, then I discovered that I wasn't the only one to realize that the secret of the non-Western meditation is actually due to non-commutativity. So I discovered, Larry Domash, he made the same claim about mantras, the use of mantras in meditation. He says that it accessed this non-commutative 1/2 spin in the brain as a quantum potential. And he used to teach at Hampshire College, where I went where I took quantum physics. My first year of college. And then Eddie Oceans, who worked at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, he was also a physicist who's coined the phrase quantum psychology as based on non-commutativity, and he realized that non-commutativity was the secret of the non-Western meditation. Thanks.